Services portfolio, and we will return to Senator Steele-John with outcome 3.
Thank you. So just a couple of quick questions of clarification in relation to the trial statistics that you've given us so far. So you expressed a desire for the participation in the trial to be broadly reflective of a diverse cohort of participants generally in the scheme. I think can you just give me quickly again the markers that you've used in defining that?
So the way that the data we're looking for is a fair representation of gender,
yep,
of age, of region, so size of location, of disability type, of socioeconomic region as well.
Right. When you say fair, how are we defining fair in this context?
It represents the scheme as it currently stands.
Right. So that was what you were aiming for when you went out to your 60,000 people, inviting them to be part of the scheme?
Correct.
Of the 5,819 people that are currently participating in the pilot,
yep.
Where are we in relation to meeting? How far are we off actually meeting those metrics?
We've again, as Mr. Hoffman's mentioned, we're north of 1,800 completed assessments. Mm-hmm. We are tracking the striation of that against the representative sample, and the pilot should represent, the population when we're done. Which means if we are a little bit short in one of those categories, we will go back and redouble our efforts to contact those participants to ensure a fair representation.
And upon completion of the process, are participants given access to a satisfaction survey?
Yes.
Are you able to give us any of the data so far that you've collected from that?
We've recently started the assessment. We've received just over 100 back. And I think it's appropriate that once we actually have more of a representative sample, that we will intend to share the pilot and evaluation results as we've committed to.
So how many people have completed so far again? 1,000?
So
1,850 have completed.
1,850.
219 have returned the feedback survey.
How do you account for the disparity in the numbers between completed and sent back the survey?
Because it is optional and opt-in to do. So that's over about a 12% completion rate. That's pretty good for this sort of survey.
Are you able to actually provide any information as to what detail you've had from that feedback so far?
Subject to Oliver's comments, Mr. Blank's comments about only less than halfway through, etc. We have seen good results in that. 78% of those reporting have reported that it was a good to excellent experience with the way the IA was conducted. Another 14% said it was fair, leaving 8% as being a poor experience. So at 78% saying it was good to excellent, I think that's, we want to improve that. That's part of the reason we're doing the pilot. But we're getting overall good feedback and results from that. There have been some cases of people not having a good experience and saying so. We've also had many people in the feedback, in the free text, giving strong positive comments about the experience and being prepared to do it again.
Now, I understand from an actuarial point of view that 219 responses out of a possible pool of just over 1,000 may be considered statistically significant. That would be from where you were drawing your 78% reported good rating. But from a community point of view, I would put to you that it's actually very concerning that we have received so little feedback from people. Would be quite concerned that within the pool there has actually been very little feedback as to what people's experience is like for them so far.
Well, Senator, I don't agree, because I think when you do an opt-in survey, you respect people's choice as to what they want to say. Getting those sorts of results is a good survey. You might, and to have those who choose to do it then give strongly positive feedback, I think is a good signal and sample.
But how do you account for the fact that people may have found it, and if you go by what has been reported to me, have found it to be such a profoundly distressing experience that you may not actually feel able to fill in the form, and therefore you do not end up giving feedback? How the hell do you account? Apologies, Chair. How do you account for that?
Well, I would say that is more likely, I think, that people who've had a negative experience will be giving us that feedback. And the fact that people are choosing in an opt-in to give strongly positive is a good sign.
What services do, what mental health, given that so many people have publicly talked about the impact, particularly in terms of mental health, that this process has, and I have experienced an independent assessment myself, not in the context of the NDIS, but in a different context, and I can tell you, it was during my time here as an MP, and it was a deeply traumatic experience, which I had to end, because I had never in my life been asked questions, such as the questions I was asked in that process. So what steps are taken to connect and provide people with mental health supports who are participating in your trial, should they require those supports?
Well, Senator, that's part of the clinical and personal experience of the assessors. They are trained, they're qualified, they have experience, they'd be aware of those potential issues. But I also want to say, assessments are not new for the NDIS. It is built around the need to do functional assessments, often with people who you don't always know, including the planners, including the LACs, etc. So this is a fairer, more consistent approach, but it's not new in the sense of doing a functional assessment and asking questions about function.
It is extraordinarily distressing, as you have heard, and if you were to listen, I think, a bit more carefully to some of the evidence that you hear and the feedback you've had, you'd be able to understand why. However, I think we will leave that there, and I just, because I'm aware of the time, I need to go to a different line of questioning. To you, I think this will be to you, Minister. This is a very, like I'll say at the outset, there's a very serious line of questioning. I don't enter into this with any kind of flippancy. Yesterday, in health estimates, we were able to determine that under the pharmaceutical benefit scheme, the government currently funds, or the Australian government currently funds and has for the last 20 odd years, the drugs related to erectile dysfunction. And they have funded those drugs to the tune of about $50 million over the last 20 years or so. Now, in my view, that is good. That is as it should be. That is somebody with an impairment, and there's a medication that can treat that, and that is all well, good and fine. So that is something your government does. At the same time, we have a situation where the government is pursuing a change to the definition of reasonable and necessary, primarily under the argument that it is against community expectations for a sex-based support to be funded under an NDIS plan. So I'd like you to please explain the disconnect, where on one hand we have a government funding for 20 years in a bipartisan way a medication, a therapeutic medication for the treatment of erectile dysfunction in people, while on the other hand suggesting that it is not within community expectations to fund a similar therapeutic support or assistance to a disabled person.
Obviously, the matter that you raised goes to a very serious issue. I have to say, Senator, that I am not across the kind of policy nuance that I think I would need to answer your question just off the cuff now. But I would be more than happy to take it offline and come back to you with a more considered response, because I really would prefer to avail myself with some more information around the matters that you are talking about.
You would be aware, though, of the minister, of the government's intention to amend the definition of reasonable and necessary.
My understanding that there's been discussion in relation to reform around the NDIS. I mean, you've just been discussing some issues with Mr. Hoffman in relation to independent assessments, but because I am not the minister responsible and I don't feel that I'm informed enough to have this conversation, I'm quite happy to take your questions and respond to you, but I just don't feel that I'm qualified to give you the kind of informed response off the cuff that I think you deserve.
The current definition the current legislation in relation to the definition of reasonable and necessary is actually that it very purposefully does not define reasonable and necessary, but sets out a list of principles by which reasonable and necessary may be ascertained within the context of an individual's circumstances, recognising that a disabled person's impairments and therefore the reasonable and necessary adjustments needed to address those impairments and support them to live a good life are the product of the interaction between an impairment and the environment in which a disabled person exists at multiple different points in time. Now, should the government seek to amend the Act to insert a definition of reasonable and necessary, this would fundamentally change the way that this Act functions and would, in effect, concentrate power in the hands of the federal government in relation to the determination of reasonable and necessary, would it not?
Well, as I said, Senator, I mean, what you're talking about is quite I would imagine, quite a complex legal interpretation in relation to the actual legislation itself. And I don't feel that I'm well enough informed in relation to the legal interface in terms of the use of terms in legislation to be able to have a good debate with you at the moment. But I mean, the officials at the table may have a greater understanding, or perhaps the Secretary may have a greater understanding. But I'm certainly happy to take it away and come back with that.
Rules.
Now, I'm aware that I'm against the clock and I need to move to Quality and Safeguards Commission, so I'll be happy to hear a little bit of additional information, but also happy to take it on notice and continue the conversation.
Thanks, Senator. Just, I think the Minister Robert has been quite clear on his intention to make some changes to the legislation, but he has also been quite clear that he intends on releasing a draft bill for consultation. I agree with you, there are lots of complexities around how you define terms in legislation. The department continues to work with stakeholders. We work with the people who are responsible for drafting legislation to enact the government's policy intent, and then that legislation or the draft bill will be released for consultation as the Minister has committed when that draft is ready.
Okay. I mean, the contention that I would put to you, Minister, and the contention that I would put generally to my Senate colleagues is that because disability is a product of the interaction of an impairment and environmental factors, it is in fact impossible to legislate a specific definition of reasonable and necessary in a way that would not intentionally or unintentionally prevent the scheme from providing supports which would otherwise be considered reasonable and necessary in certain contexts. That's exactly why, and Senator Siewert was around at the time, there wasn't a clear definition given in the Act in the first place. Now, can I move to Mr Head and the Quality and Safeguards Commission just to finish off?
6 minutes to go.
Ooh.
Well, we've actually got 2 minutes, but yeah, I'll give you this.
I can do a huge amount
Very generous.
in 6 minutes. Thank you. All right. So we've spent a lot of time today talking about independent assessments, and I just want to ask you to begin. How many complaints have been raised by the Commission in relation to independent assessors?
Well, I would be able to give you a breakdown that specific. At the moment, we have classes of complaints that we accept or that we categorise things in. So I really just don't have that information. I would imagine, because it's a pilot program of the way that it's being run, that we would probably have received very few complaints, and they may well not be in the current phase of the pilot program within our jurisdiction yet.
Okay. So, is it your understanding that they are I should have actually asked you that at the beginning? Are independent assessors carrying out this work in the pilot currently under your purview?
I think in the pilot phase, that's well, the code of conduct applies to anyone who is providing a support, so that will hang really on whether or not independent assessments classify as supports during this phase of the process. I think the intention is that we would have jurisdiction. I can look at our complaints data and provide on notice whether or not we are receiving any complaints.
Okay, I might have to call Mr. Hoffman back to the table to just clarify whether that is the intent or whose decision is it at the end of the day, whether they're covered by yourself? Is that an agency decision or a?
Our jurisdiction is determined by the provider definition rules in the Act, and what applies depending on what the rules say.
Okay.
So the Act itself determines certain features of whether somebody is a provider for us, and then the provider definition rules deal with other components.
Okay, Mr. Hoffman.
So, yes, Senator, the intent is very much that provision of independent assessments, those providers will be subject to the regulation of the Commission.
Are they currently?
For the
Pilot.
that I will take on notice, Senator. I'm not sure of that.
Okay, because I have had a number of reports. There have been a number of public reports of disabled people being asked to undertake tasks within their home, and particularly within their bedroom. And I suspect I don't need to elaborate much to be able to draw your attention to how that could potentially create an environment where abuse or other mistreatment could take place. And I would like to be able to very quickly tell people that report inappropriate activity to me who they can contact. So if you can get that to me on notice quickly, that would be good.
Yes, sir.
And then I'll just ask you, Mr. Head, we had a couple of exchanges at the last estimate session. This will be my last question, Chair. So we had an exchange at the previous estimate session where you were able to inform me that with the money you had been provided by the government in relation to increasing the resourcing of the Commission, you'd hired an additional, I think it was 100 staff, and of those 100, you had placed, you'd allocated across the entire Commission. You placed about 5 or 6, if I remember rightly, in the role of members of the investigative team, I think the definition was. And I was just wanting to ask you whether, yes, it was part of the investigations team, whether that number has shifted since we last had an opportunity to chat.
So I might get Ms. Taylor to give you the up-to-date numbers on investigators. I think the point I made, Senator, is that investigations, there are certain staff who are our specialist investigators who are specifically empowered under the Regulatory Powers Act to do certain things that are required in gathering evidence, etc. And there are our complaints officers and reportable incident staff who, in the nature of their normal work, examine complaints, investigate them, as it were. So the discussion was about specialist versus the other roles.
I remember.
And our recruitment is proceeding well, and I think you have the number of investigators.
So we've increased the number of investigation positions to 31. Last time I think we spoke about having 21 positions in the organisation. And we've also supplemented that with a contract for an additional intensive 6 investigators between this part of the year and 30th of June to assist in bringing to conclusion a number of matters where we need additional external investigative expertise.
Okay, thank you. Look, I'll just finish with a comment to the minister. Minister, in the context where we are conducting a Royal Commission into violence, abuse, neglect and exploitation of disabled people, where we know that violence, abuse, neglect and exploitation is pretty much endemic among our community, and where we are having a national conversation about the treatment, particularly of women in relation to sexual violence, and we know sexual violence is something which is terribly perpetrated against disabled women. I am really concerned that the independent assessment pilot commenced and has now rolled out without there being clarity as to whether independent assessors fell within the jurisdiction of the Commission. I understand that Mr Hoffman has taken it on notice, but it is really worrying to me that a clear complaints process wasn't something that Mr Head or Mr Hoffman was able to vomit out at the table. It should have been in this particular context, and I really hope that you will be able to quickly get to me exactly what I can tell people that say I've had to undertake a task in my home in a way that I felt was inappropriate. I'm now frightened. I want to report that.
Senator, I've heard very clearly the issues that you've raised tonight, and I think, you know, without verballing the officers, I think they've also heard the concerns that you've put forward and respond as quickly as possible to your concerns.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Senator Green.